Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
The wife has decided to use a method of manipulation to get her way, but for what exactly? In the final installment, we'll reveal all the cards. Enjoy the show! Taylor, I said, we might have something. I'll check. Kevin, thank you, she exclaimed and hugged me, then kissed me on the cheek. On the way back home, Melinda mentioned that kiss to me. What was that kiss from Taylor? She asked, not entirely angry but far from happy. I explained, okay, I guess. Melinda answered, and I was a little pleased that she was the one who was jealous. A few weeks later, we actually hired Janice. I now hoped that she would be able to perform the minimum tasks required of a receptionist. The months passed in a stable, expected rhythm, nothing particularly exciting, but also without major disasters. I was comfortable with this lifestyle. I continued to perform well and was rewarded monetarily according to my achievements. Melinda started talking about the big house. Housing prices continued to rise as predicted, and I knew we could sell my house for a profit and afford to buy something bigger. It was Melinda's idea. My much more conservative plan was to save for the girls' college education while we stayed in my house. Melinda half-heartedly agreed to this plan for now. Several things happened in the following year. The first of these was the death of Melinda's father. We received a call in the middle of the night. It was Melinda's mom. I listened as Melinda took the call. There was no immediate emotional breakdown, no tears. I suppose we had all been mourning his deteriorating health for some time now, and I'm also guessing that I wasn't the only one who felt relief as one of the many emotions I began to process with the news. After all the activities associated with the death of a close family member, there is a period of emptiness where everyone begins to process what life will look like next. For Melinda, this manifested itself in her keeping all her emotions inside. There was a noticeable distance between her and me, and I also noticed her slight aloofness toward the girls. I assumed this was her way of dealing with her own grief. I also assumed that in a short time, weeks, we would find a common language again. I noticed a new hostility developing between the girls. I knew that fighting between siblings could be quite normal, and of course, the two girls were very different. Francine was the more outgoing, loud younger sister compared to the older, more reserved Esme. But the strange change was that these two girls had been through a lot together. They had always been one, and now that was changing. Then there was Jean-Pierre. He tried different jobs. His personality and charisma were offset by a poor work ethic and dishonesty. He would start a job and do well for a few weeks until his true nature emerged. One look at his spotty resume, and anyone but the desperate would never hire him. One thing he thought he was more successful at was selling cars. Either he had somehow changed, or circumstances required him to conform to his work habits. He now worked for a registered pre-owned luxury vehicle dealership that sold mostly used premium European and Japanese cars. Jean-Pierre had the looks and confident attitude that suited and attracted a customer base interested in used luxury cars. It seemed like he was successful. The first time I saw a black Land Rover in front of my house, I was surprised to find Jean-Pierre inside, waiting for the girls. The last time I noticed his car, it was an old Honda Civic. I also noticed that he was drinking one of my beers and eating the expensive smoked salmon I had bought. "Hey, dude," he said affably. When I saw the salmon, I just had to try it, he told me, licking his fingers one by one. I just nodded without saying anything. It was a stressful day at work, and I was in a bad mood. Now this man was sitting in my house, drinking my beer and eating my expensive food. Later, after they left, I told Melinda about it. She usually had a long list of negative comments about Jean-Pierre, and I expected some sympathy. I was surprised by her reaction. "Kevin," she said, "what's the difference? It's just food. We can buy more." I had learned over the years of marriage that I could argue with her, win the war, but lose the battle. I didn't need us to be in some kind of quarrel. I'd had enough stress with the current changes at Van. "Okay," I replied. "I understand for now," I thought, and then I left the topic alone. What surprised me, however, was that she seemed to come to his defense. I reflected on our relationship and noted that since her father's death, we still had not been able to fully reconnect. The next day, rumors began to spread at work. the economy slowed, and demand for new homes first stabilized and then started to decline. We had forecast a slight increase for the year in our budgets. When you create a budget, it should be a reasonable guess of what you expect the business to do over a certain period of time. The problem was that there was always pressure to show growth. I remember initially forecasting flat sales for my sector. They gave me my budget back and told me to show growth. I revised my budget, and once senior management received all the budgets, they planned based on those estimated numbers. People were hired, capital assets were purchased, inventories were built up, and the business strategy for the year was based on these assumptions. As the economy cooled and sales slowed, profits were impacted. Now the shareholders were becoming dissatisfied, and senior management had to look for ways to increase profits despite slow sales. This meant one thing: reduced costs. That was the nature of rumors. What were they going to do at home? The external pressures of work began to affect our usually happy home life. Melinda's real estate sales had slowed significantly, which didn't improve her mood. I was tense, worrying about the rumors at Van, and besides, the girls were arguing. "I want my own room," Esme said. "I don't want to share a room with Francine anymore." This led to Melinda telling me about a large house she had looked at and how much of a bargain it had been. With all the uncertainties in the current economy, the last thing we needed to do was buy a more expensive home. When I told the family this, you can imagine who looked like the bad guy. Esme left in a rage, slamming the door to their room. The next day at work, I analyzed my sales numbers. Most of my products were stable or rose slightly, with the exception of the wood I bought from Tyken. Tropical hardwood sales increased by 18%. I quickly realized why premium products had not typically been used in new residential developments. This product was purchased for individual homes and renovations. This segment of the market had been less volatile than new construction. This understanding lifted my spirits a little. That afternoon, there was more news from the corporate office. Jack Valentine, my mentor and ally, was taking early retirement. He accepted the package and left. Several other experienced managers did too, and what I could only interpret as worse followed. Charlie Flanagan was promoted to the position of vice president, which Jack had held. I never liked Flanagan, and I thought he didn't like me either. I promised to keep my head down and keep working, and this worked for a while. Over the next few months, staff reductions were announced. This meant layoffs. I wasn't worried about my job, but I was worried about others. That Thursday, I received a call to meet with Charlie Flanagan at the corporate office. I was a little nervous, but at the same time confident in my performance. When I walked into the office, Flanagan made me wait 10 minutes before I was called into Jack's old office, now occupied by Flanagan. Kevin, Flanagan greeted me with a firm handshake and a fake smile. Have you ever been around someone you know isn't, but he tries to play nice? This was what I encountered. I would much rather see the idiot remain an idiot. As you know, he began, we will have to make some changes to the current business environment. Wow, am I going to get fired? I began to think. Kevin, he said with another fake smile. He must have noticed my concern. Don't worry, you are part of the family here, he exclaimed, spreading his arms in an all-encompassing gesture. But we will have to make some changes, he said, suddenly becoming much more serious. We discussed a few small things that I didn't really care about, but then he dropped the bomb, the 5% that we give to the Indian tribe in Brazil? This stops, he told me. I tried to convince him by telling him about all the good things it had done for the community. I explained that this would ensure our supply of this wood for decades to come. He laughed. The only thing I care about now is the next quarter. Finally, I told him that tropical hardwood sales were up 18%. We don't need to do that. The business supports the discount at 18%. That's good, he replied. Now we get an extra 5% profit. I like that, he added. Charlie, I said, I at least need to go and explain to them in person what we're doing. He looked at me for a long time, without false glee on his face. His true stupid nature finally showed. Okay, he agreed reluctantly, but do it quickly and as soon as possible. This ended the meeting. That night, I felt heavy in my soul. All the pride and satisfaction I had felt from helping the tribe and its people was now gone. had to meet a friend and let him down. For the first time, I began to doubt my future career at Van. At home, the girls were on edge, arguing about who knew what. Melinda wasn't in a bad mood, but our relationship didn't have the warmth it used to have. There seemed to be negative tension pressing in from all sides. After another night of the girls arguing, I suddenly had an inspiration. Most of the basement was unseparated. There was a laundry area and makeshift storage space, but there was definitely enough space to build a room in one of the corners. There were windows, so the room would have an exit, making it a viable bedroom. "Esme," I called. "I want to talk to you about something." "What?" she answered gloomily. "How about if I build you a new room?" I began, "In the basement," I said enthusiastically. "She won't sleep in a dusty old basement," Melinda chimed in, listening to the conversation. I ignored Melinda. I told Esme she could help design it, and we could paint it any color she wanted. All four of them walked down the stairs, and I showed her what I was thinking. I saw Esme's excitement sparkle at the thought of having her own new room. "How will you do it?" Melinda asked. Then I explained about building the walls, installing the electric heater, laying the floor, and installing the door. I appreciated everything I had learned working for Jim Bueller. For the first time in a long time, everyone was positive and excited. Esme talked about colors for the room, where the closet would be, and asked many other questions about her new room. Francine felt a little left out for a moment. She was usually the center of attention. "I want a room in the basement too," she exclaimed, and we all laughed. So, this night was positive. Through the darkness of recent news, rays of sunlight were breaking through. Melinda was more affectionate, and the girls didn't argue. Meanwhile, the reality of problems at work was not so easily washed away. Ryan, one of the new interns, was laid off as part of the layoffs. I liked Ryan and appreciated his work ethic. He was new to the woodworking business, but he seemed to understand the concepts well. Before he left, he went out of his way to stop by my office, thank me, leave his contact information, and shake my hand. One thing I had been putting off but knew I had to do was go to Brazil again and talk to Mafi and Tuna about changes in our program. I had to tell them the bad news. I also began to wonder if it would be possible to import this wood myself and open a small business. I could continue to work with the Mafia, and I was sure that they would want to work with me. I started looking for small business loans and made an appointment with the Small Business Administration for later in the week. In my free time, I began sketching out a business plan. On Tuesday, when I came home, Jean-Pierre was there. This was probably the longest continuous period he had spent with the girls on his regular day without a cancellation. Maybe working at registers was helping him grow up, I thought. When I walked in, it was a real family scene. Melinda and Francine were sitting at the kitchen table talking to Jean-Pierre, who was drinking one of my beers. "Kevin!" Jean-Pierre smiled welcomingly at me. "Sit down, join me," he said, picking up one of my beers. He acted as if I was a guest in his home, sitting with my wife and drinking my beer. I simply nodded to the group and went upstairs to change. From the bedroom, I heard an animated conversation coming from the kitchen. The whole scene irritated me. I knew that if I had brought this up with Melinda, things probably wouldn't have gone well. Ultimately, it was a good thing that he was a more reliable part of the girls' lives, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't trust Jean-Pierre. Although I had no reason to doubt Melinda until now, it felt like small cracks were starting to appear in our foundation. A week later, I was on an Azul flight to Brazil. Throughout the flight, I tried to think about how best to tell Mafi and Tuna about the new financial changes. I wondered how they would react. Another thought I kept considering was starting my own business. Can I do this? Is it possible for me to be successful? Can I make money from this? These were the questions I debated with myself as I flew through the dark night sky. When I arrived in Mafi's village, it felt like a celebration. Music was playing, some were wearing ceremonial masks, and I could smell the delicious food being cooked. All of this made me feel even worse about the situation. After a warm hug, we sat down in the large dining area, which was filled with plenty of food and drinks. "Kevin, my good friend," Mafi began, "how are you?" I couldn't match Mafi's wide smile and had to look away. I felt like I had let all these good people down. Would all the achievements they made in their village, the orphanage and school, have to stop? Would they have to stop paying the teachers? These thoughts were racing through my head as I considered how to tell them about this. "Kevin," Mafi said, looking into my eyes. I could see concern on his face. "Tell me," he asked. I took a deep breath and tried to explain the financial downturn, the slowdown in home construction, and the decline in stock prices. Ultimately, I was able to convey to him how my company was being forced to change financial relationships that had been so successful for a long time. "Kevin," Mafi began, his wide smile now gone, "you don't do this. Does the big company decide?" "Yes," I said, nodding my head. He then conveyed to me that he should discuss this with some others and suggested that I take a walk to the orphan school. I sat down on a stump on a small hill overlooking the orphan school. I thought about all my problems. The job was stressful and could get worse. My relationship with Melinda was on the rocks. The girls had been less happy in recent days, and I didn't trust Jean-Pierre. But he was inextricably woven into our lives. My mood darkened as I thought about all my problems, but then, like a bolt from the blue, I opened my eyes and listened. There were children around me who had almost nothing, not even parents, but they laughed, rejoiced, and played. I looked at the group and saw one little girl, no older than 5 years old. She sang and played, clapping her hands, dressed almost in rags. I was just enjoying life. Oh, how I kicked myself for all my petty problems. At that moment, I knew what I was going to do. I was never afraid of hard work and was confident in my abilities. The only thing holding me back was leaving the comfort and safety of Van. I hesitated because my comfort was disturbed, and then I looked at these children and realized I was worried about my comfort. I immediately went to find Mafi and explained to him what I wanted to do. He met me halfway along the path, a big smile on his face again. It looked like Mafi and Tuna were thinking along the same lines as me. Without all the details, Kevin said, "Mafi, you buy wood from Tyken, you sell, and then you pay. That would actually be wonderful." What I remembered from my business classes in college was that cash flow is one of the biggest challenges for a new small business. If I can pay them after I sell the wood, it will greatly ease the cash flow problem. We talked late into the night about all the details of our new agreement. The discount from Van expires in 90 days, so I had 3 months to set up my business. I already had a pretty good deal of confidence from the SBA that I could get some kind of loan, and I could cash out my 401k. I also had some savings, so I would have working capital. When I got home that Thursday night, I was excited to tell Melinda about my plan. Luckily, the girls didn't argue, and I had uninterrupted time to talk to Mel. I excitedly told her about my plan, the potential, and my agreement with Tuna. The anxiety I had was not reflected in Melinda's reaction. "You mean you won't necessarily have a steady paycheck?" she asked. I kept trying to explain the margin I expected from the wood, and that was before I added other lines. She looked at me with blank eyes, expressing no support for my business plan. "Okay, I guess," she said unconvincingly. "Just try to leave on good terms, so they'll hire you again if it doesn't work out," she added. Her attitude made me angry. I understood that she was worried. I knew that before we started dating, she had inconsistent months of income, and deep down, I also knew that part of my attraction to her in the first place was my stability and security. I understood, but what upset me the most was that she didn't have enough confidence in me. Over the next 3 months, I built a small business. I found a warehouse to rent, confirmed my relationship with Tuna and Mafi, wrote a business plan, and submitted it to the SBA. I was approved for a loan with a low interest rate. There were a lot of other details, but for now, I was amazed at how smoothly everything went. One difficult thing I had to do was hire staff. I thought that I definitely needed an office employee and a warehouse employee. The fact that Van was in the process of downsizing made it easier. I ended up hiring Janice Pilkington, Taylor's absent-minded sister, who compensated for her absent-mindedness by working hard, and Albert Ramos to work in the warehouse and shipping department. I made another hire, Ryan Christensen. Ryan was an intern who had been laid off at the beginning of the downsizing. My bet was that Ryan would be a good inside sales coordinator. Without sales, we wouldn't have a business. When I asked Ryan, he completely agreed. He was recently married and had just learned that his wife was pregnant with their first child. "Thank you, Kevin," Ryan replied after I asked him to join my new business. "I promise I won't let you down." In the last few weeks before launching my business, I met with Charlie Flanagan. I requested an appointment with him at his office without providing any additional details. "So what's going on?" asked Flanagan. No fake pleasantries this time. "Charlie," I began, "this is my official 2-week notice." I handed him a sheet of paper. "My last day will be February 24th. Flanagan simply stared at me, processing the implications of my information. "So what the hell are you going to do?" he asked without any politeness or warmth. His true nature was revealed. I explained vaguely that I was going to try something of my own for a while without going into detail. Before he had time to start ranting about non-compete agreements or violations of any corporate policy, I brought up the issue. "I've already talked to HR and the legal department," I said. "Nothing I'm doing violates any employee enterprise agreements." I saw his face turn red. He was starting to get angry. Flanagan always wanted to be in control. I could tell he was trying to find some way to thwart my plans, but he couldn't find anything. "Okay," he said dismissively, "you probably would have been fired anyway. This will save me severance pay." The final blow came as he turned to the computer screen. Meanwhile, things were still a little tense at home, but at least they weren't getting any worse. I was home late because I was setting up the office and warehouse. After normal business hours, I usually didn't get home until 7 o'clock and still left around 5 o'clock every morning. I knew that at some point, Melinda and I would have to talk to repair our relationship, but I was so caught up in the excitement of starting a business that I put it aside. For a short time, I thought I was still working on Esme's new room. She was almost ready. I just had to install the trim, hang a hanger in the closet, and paint it. I told Esme that she and I could paint it this weekend. "You and I can go to the paint store on Saturday morning," I said, "and you can pick a color." She seemed pleased with this. That Saturday, Melinda and Francine were shopping, so it was just Esme and me in her new room, which we were now painting a soft pastel yellow called Summer Dawn. We were comfortable in silence, both painting our areas. Esme was still introverted, but we had a good relationship and talked. This morning, she was abnormally quiet. I could tell something was bothering her. "Is everything okay, Esme?" I asked, applying more Summer Dawn. At first, I didn't know if she heard me. She didn't answer. I glanced at her, and she looked heavy, as if she was pondering a serious question. "Esme?" I asked a few minutes later. She answered, "I don't love my father." "What?" I noticed his presence much more regularly than before. I hoped this was a sign of his stability and would be better for the girls in the long run. I was only concerned about their well-being. I didn't trust Jean-Pierre. He constantly drank my beer and ate our food. It was tolerable as long as he was good with the girls. "Why?" I asked. "What's happening?" She was silent for several minutes, trying, I suppose, to find the words to explain her feelings. She continued to say that he told her things that she did not believe were true. He said negative things about me in a joking tone and talked about their mom as if Melinda and Jean-Pierre were going to get back together at some point. She thought that what he was saying was confusing Francine and that she was beginning to believe him. "I don't believe what he's telling us," Esme said. "Parents have a special influence on their children. From an early age, children depend on the guidance and knowledge they receive from their parents. When a child begins to doubt the words of their parents, it confuses them. Their foundation is shaken, and for a child, this can lead to a lack of trust." I asked Esme about the type of things he was saying. While I was a little worried about what he was saying about me, I was much more concerned about his attempt to destabilize our family. I knew this was a problem that Melinda and I would have to solve together. Later that evening, when the girls were busy, I told Melinda about the conversation with Esme. "Oh, I know. Jean-Pierre says things sometimes. I don't think it's a big problem," she told me. "Melinda," I replied, surprised by her indifferent attitude. "If he's trying to undermine our family, I think that's a big problem. Either you talk to him, or I will." "Okay," she answered, now angry with me. "I'll talk to him on Tuesday." Mel, honey, I began, walking over to her for a hug. I'm just trying to give the girls some stability. She didn't completely turn away from me, but she didn't respond with warmth. When I started this business and it began to go in the right direction, I was really going to put energy into rebuilding our relationship. I promised myself that. The good news was that business was booming almost from day one. Part of this was thanks to my good friend Alan Church of McLean's Lumber. He immediately promised his support. I needed to be competitive on price and provide good service, but he gave us an opportunity for their business. Another stroke of luck happened in our third month. I received a call from Jack Valentine, my old mentor at Van. It seemed that after early retirement from Van, Jack bought an interest in a small custom mill that produced custom logs. After some greetings, he got down to business. I'm looking for a new distributor. Are you interested? Asked Jack. I knew I would need to have other lines besides the wood I was getting from Brazil. I thought for a moment about specialized logs. This would fit well into our current product range. I told Jack I was all for it. We agreed to meet. Compared to all the businesses that Van did, we were a tiny dot. But at this point, as I learned through rumors, was becoming an irritant for Charlie Flanagan. We hadn't seen a direct response yet, but I couldn't ignore the fact that this was a possible threat in the future. Meanwhile, business was still going well. By May, our third month, we were already profitable. I traveled up and down the West Coast, and we established dealers in all the major markets. These trips strained our marriage. If I had spent some time and really analyzed things, I would have had a much better understanding of what was really going on with the marriage. But at that moment, I was focused on my new business. I felt that our relationship was strong enough to survive this short-term situation. At first, Melinda complained and was upset about my work schedule and travel. I begged her to look at the bigger picture and see how great this would be for our future. I was building something good, and I was worried about her displeasure. Over time, things got a little better. We still hadn't regained the deep relationship we once had, but her complaints about my schedule seemed to lessen and then stop. At the time, I thought this was good. Looking back, I realized this was the time when I really should have been worried. Jean-Pierre had become a much more regular part of my children's and our family's lives. When I saw him, he acted like an old friend. It was not uncommon for him to knock twice on the door and then immediately enter if the door was not locked. Then he would head to the refrigerator and help himself. If I didn't know him better, I might even have liked him. He had a special charisma that I'm sure attracted his customers to the car lot, but I knew it was all fake. Sometimes I saw flashes of the true Jean-Pierre. He was jealous, petty, competitive, and manipulative, especially with girls. Francine seemed especially susceptible to his influence. I'd almost given up trying to talk to Melinda about it. She seemed to agree with me less and less on these issues. Where I once thought that she and I were a team dealing with life's challenges together, I now often felt like it was Melinda who was standing up to me. I still hoped that I could mend our relationship. I just needed to make sure the business was up and running and thriving first. We were moving in this direction, and I hoped that all my efforts, travel and long hours, would pay off in the success of the business. I also felt responsible for providing stability to my small team. There were only 4 of us: Janice, Taylor's older sister, who was a single mother with 3 children, Ryan, a former intern at Van whose wife was pregnant with their first child, and finally, Albert. I didn't know much about Albert, but I remembered that he had many photographs of his children at work. These people had worked diligently with me to build our business and make it successful. I knew they sacrificed a lot for the company, and I really appreciated that. I felt a burden of responsibility to the employees of my small company and the work they did to make it successful. When the fall of our first year arrived, it felt like I could finally exhale. Business was going well, and our sales were growing steadily. People loved working with us, and we took on a few more projects, and it worked. Full of optimism about the business, my spirits lifted, and I called Melinda. It was Tuesday, and I knew that the girls were usually with Jean-Pierre on Tuesdays. I suggested going to dinner. I was also hoping for some physical intimacy before the girls got home tonight. Melinda answered, I'm not sure. It's been a long day. Not the enthusiasm I was hoping for, but she didn't say no. Come on, Mel, I replied. When was the last time we went out together? She fell silent. Several moments passed. Okay, she finally answered evenly. Not a strong endorsement, but I was sure that when we were together, we would have a good time again. That Tuesday night, Jean-Pierre walked into my house like he owned it. He grabbed a beer and sat down at the kitchen table, waiting for the girls. He was relaxed, smiling, and talking to me happily as if he were an old friend. A few minutes later, Melinda came down the stairs, dressed nicely with light makeup for our evening. She looked really good, and Jean-Pierre noticed it. "My dear," he exclaimed, "Melinda, you look magnificent." He smiled and asked, "Are you going somewhere?" "Yes, Kevin and I are going to dinner," she replied. "Is it true?" Jean-Pierre asked in surprise. I watched the scene unfold, noticing that the slight smile on Jean-Pierre's face had disappeared. I also noticed that Melinda avoided meeting his gaze. She almost seemed guilty about going out with me. The whole scene was strange and bothered me. Later at dinner, I debated whether to bring up the subject of Jean-Pierre. On the one hand, I needed to understand what was happening. Previously, the dynamics were strange, to put it mildly. On the other hand, we were having a good time, one of the best times we'd had together in months. I knew that if I said the wrong thing, the whole evening could be ruined. I decided not to say anything, to monitor the situation more closely, and, if necessary, to take action at another time. The following week, I went on a business trip to California. I was supposed to return on Wednesday, but I was able to finish all my business on Tuesday in the middle of the day and went to the airport early in the afternoon. There was a 3:40 p.m. flight that arrived in SeaTac around 6 p.m. I got out early and spent an hour talking with my friend Alan Church. It was 50% business and 50% personal. Right before we were supposed to board, my phone died. Unfortunately, I remembered that I had packed the charger in my checked luggage. I thought, I guess I'll just surprise Melinda and the girls with my arrival tonight instead of tomorrow. It was already dark when I arrived home that Tuesday evening. The lights were on in my house when I arrived. We've all heard stories about businessmen who arrive home early and find their wives with someone else. In fact, in some respects, I might prefer that to what I found. When I opened the door, there was pizza on the kitchen table, music was playing, and Francine and Jean-Pierre were laughing. I felt like a trespasser. All four of them were having fun in my house, and all eyes were directed at me in surprise when I entered with a suitcase. Melinda looked guilty, as if she had been caught doing something bad. Esme just looked at me with slight sadness on her face. Francine didn't stop what she was doing and barely noticed me. Good old Jean-Pierre was calm and friendly. "Welcome to my home, Kevin," he began. "Welcome. Would you like something to drink?" He acted as if it were his home and I was the guest. He looked into the refrigerator. "There's no beer," he said. "Kevin," Melinda interjected, "I thought you were coming back on Wednesday." "It's girls' night with Jean-Pierre, and they brought pizza home," she explained. It was a completely logical explanation, except that there were several things wrong with the situation, including the fact that Jean-Pierre acted as if this was his home and that Melinda had so naturally joined in the fun. "Yes," I said. "I finished my business early." I walked up the stairs to the bedroom, starting to put my things away and unpack my suitcase. From the kitchen below came the muffled sounds of Jean-Pierre saying something and Francine laughing. A few minutes later, Melinda came into our bedroom. "How was your trip?" she asked. Although I believed that it was important to Melinda that my business did well, she was never particularly interested in the details of its success. I was silent, still processing the circumstances of the evening. Finally, I looked at Melinda. "Melinda," I said, "everything went well. Now, why don't you go back downstairs and join the girls? I've had a long few days." I let her go, but she froze before walking away. "You act like you're angry about something," she said. "Yes, I guess," I said too loudly, then continued more quietly. "I come home, and the whole family, including my wife, is having fun in my house, including your disgusting ex-husband, who has failed these girls countless times. Not to mention, he acts like our refrigerator is his, too." This was probably more than I wanted to say, but I couldn't help myself. I was tired, and Jean-Pierre's behavior irritated me. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," she said. "Jean-Pierre has recovered, and it's important that he be in their lives. After all, he is their father." She made it clear that I was to understand this last point. After that statement, I was angry, but most of all, I was hurt. I love these girls. I tried to be there for them throughout their lives. I can't count how many times Jean-Pierre let them down. I felt that I was much more of a father to them than Jean-Pierre would ever be. "Okay," I said, "I understand," and fell silent. She stood watching me unpack, saying nothing. After a few minutes, she quietly left. This was the beginning of a general decline in our already not very close relationship. I even felt it from Francine, sometimes, never from Esme. If anything, she and I had become closer. I knew that she understood her father's true nature. She saw through his acting. But things between Melinda and me were definitely going in the wrong direction. In retrospect, looking back at that time, I realized that there were two main reasons that contributed to everything that happened. First, it was Jean-Pierre, or more accurately, Jean-Pierre and Melinda's deep, long-rooted attraction to him. Intellectually, I was sure she knew he was irresponsible, untrustworthy, and selfish, but there was this attraction to the bad boy that overshadowed the stable security she found in me. Second, my work schedule and circumstances that occurred in early January added to the problem. There was also a sense of responsibility for my small team of employees and my enormous responsibility for the success of the business. If I were still working at Van, I later reflected, I could have invested more time in the marriage, and perhaps things could have turned out differently. But that's not what happened. There was some level of heat, although there were no direct discussions about the problems. Our once healthy nightlife had faded, and it was rare that our moods matched. Then I got the call in January. Despite the negative environment in my home, the business was doing well. We had a successful first year and were planning for growth in the second year. My small team worked together, and our business grew. I appreciated the hard work, long hours, and other sacrifices my 3 employees made. Almost half of our business was now associated with McLean's Lumber. This was largely due to my friendship with Alan Church. I made sure Alan got good deals, and Alan ensured a constant flow of business. However, I knew that having so much business with one client was a risky situation. If there were any disruption to the business, it could be catastrophic, and that's exactly what happened. I found myself in the office when I saw an incoming call from Alan Church. "Hey, buddy, what happened?" I asked. "Relax, man. This is really hard," he began. Suddenly, my relaxed mood disappeared. I knew Alan well enough to know from the tone of his voice that this was not a good thing. It turned out that Van offered McLean's an incredible deal to supply tropical wood for a year. They went straight to Alan's boss. "What price did they offer you?" I asked, thinking that maybe we could even it out. When he named the price, it was below my costs. I couldn't get any closer to the Van deal. I knew this was Charlie Flanagan shot across the bow. "Kevin, I'm sorry," Alan said. "I have tried. I talked about your quality and the excellent service you provide. It didn't matter," he explained. "My management said we needed to be price competitive in the market." I thanked him, and we soon hung up. I sat there, crunching the numbers, our sales bills, our expenses, our cash reserves. Losing McLean's business would really hurt. By my calculations, we could be out of business within 3 months, maybe 4. I needed to do something. I gathered my staff. It wasn't difficult, there were only 3 of them. I told them the news and explained that I was working on a plan. The problem I didn't tell them was that I had no idea what the plan was. I told them that if anyone wanted to leave and find a job elsewhere, I would totally understand. They just sat and looked at me, shocked, I think, and no one spoke for a couple of minutes. Finally, Albert said something. "Boss," he began, "will we still be paid?" I took a deep breath. "Yes, you will all still be paid," I said, "but if you have other options, please feel free to consider them." As I stood and looked at them, I wondered how I was going to pay them the way I just said. At this moment, I didn't know. "Kevin," Ryan interrupted my gloomy thoughts, "I'm not going anywhere." I think if we all work hard, we can get through this, he told me. I'm with Ryan, Janice Pilkington said. Albert simply nodded in agreement. Okay, thanks, everyone, I told them. I'll come up with a plan and keep everyone informed. I was touched by the loyalty of my employees, but the burden of responsibility weighed heavily on my shoulders. Janice, a single mother with 3 children, Ryan with a newborn, and I knew that Albert also had a family. It was a big responsibility, and I also had to think about my family. When I broke the news back home, the response was not as positive as that of my staff. I asked everyone to sit down at the kitchen table. We needed to discuss something important. I explained my business situation and said that we would have to save for several months. What do you mean by saving? Melinda asked, standing with her arms crossed. We'll have to watch what we spend, cut back on some things, and just be careful, I explained. But my birthday is next month, and you promised me an iPhone. Francine said. Esme got an iPhone when she was my age, she added. Well, we'll see, was the only thing I could agree on at the moment. Francine was angry and expressed it. Melinda was angry but remained silent. Only Esme seemed to understand. The family meeting broke up. Francine slammed the door and Melinda left. I sat deep in thought, trying to analyze all the possible options for my business and my life when I received an unexpected kiss on the cheek from Esme. I was surprised. Esme was usually quite reserved. Thank you, Esme, I told her. I appreciate this gesture. It was her way of saying, I understand, and I'm on your side. I sat up late that night going over our finances as well as the business's finances. The problem was cash flow. We had inventory, but I needed money to keep the business going. One of the ideas I considered was to take up construction on the side. In our area, it always seemed like someone needed a fence, new siding, a deck, or a garage. If I worked Saturdays and Sundays, I thought I would have enough to pay our household bills. On Monday morning, more bad news arrived. More of our customers switched to the van product. Our sales would suffer even more. I hit the road. Over the course of the week, I closed several new deals and retained some more of our existing business. Not enough, but it helped. I got into a routine where I spent my days in the field making sales and my evenings during the week in the office, doing all the other tasks required to run a business. I contracted a side job for the weekend. I was building a fence for a neighbor 2 streets away. This gave me the money I needed to cover my running expenses. 100% of business income went towards paying employees' salaries and other operating expenses. I knew deep down that it wouldn't be enough. Over the next month, business was 40% below target. It was unsustainable. My reserves were depleting too quickly. In the market, I saw van products everywhere. Their material was not as high quality as ours, but it was cheap. I continued to work day and night. Our home life, as difficult as it was, became even worse. I was hardly ever home, and when I was constantly asked about money, our finances, and bills. I started sleeping a few nights a week in the office. I had an all-expenses-paid trip planned to Brazil back in the good times when money wasn't such an issue. I was supposed to leave in 30 days. No matter how much I was needed here, I still needed to go to Brazil. Something was wrong with Melinda, and for some reason, I thought it had to do with Jean-Pierre. Not long ago, despite the growing gap between us, we communicated. It wasn't always positive, but at least we knew what was going on in each other's lives. Many conversations concerned the girls, their little successes, their problems, and the day-to-day discussions that parents have about their children. Our communication had practically stopped. In many ways, it was my fault. I was so caught up in running the business that I didn't notice what was going on in our family life until we reached a point where we weren't talking to each other. One of the things we were always in complete agreement on was Jean-Pierre, his failings as a parent and how best to protect the girls emotionally from his many failures as a father. I began to notice that in some of our rare discussions, when I brought up the topic of Jean-Pierre, she no longer talked about his poor parenting skills. In fact, I remembered one particular discussion that illustrated how much things had changed. Will Jean-Pierre pick up the girls tomorrow evening? I asked. Yes, came the monosyllabic answer from Melinda. Wow, I said, This could be some kind of record, for weeks in a row without bringing in the girls. I said half jokingly. Well, he's been around a lot more than you have lately, she answered. Mel, I began, I'm trying to save my business. I'm trying to do this for you and the girls, you know it. I added, starting to get angry at myself. You and this stupid business, she said. Why don't you get a normal job and bring home a regular salary? I just looked at her. She knew how important my business was to me. Then she insulted me and implied that I had let my family down financially. I worked a minimum of 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. I was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. I bit my tongue, not trusting what I could tell her. She mistook my silence for weakness and made one last criticism. At least Jean-Pierre earns a stable income, she told me. You, I hissed. I had never sworn at her like that before. I was angry, hurt, and confused. I stood up abruptly, grabbed my things, and left, heading to my office. One last look at her was met with a look of pure anger. In my office, I sat and thought about the problems in my life. In general terms, it was my marriage and my business. I focused on business because it seemed like an immediate necessity. I was confident enough in my relationship with Melinda to believe that she would understand the need for long hours. It looks like I may have overestimated this question. Okay, I swore to myself I knew I needed to invest some time in my marriage. Let's talk tomorrow. Perhaps it's best that we both cool off tonight. The rest of the evening, I focused on business. It was Tuesday evening, about 7 o'clock. I collected some money for a bouquet of flowers for Mel, a sign of reconciliation. I almost knocked when I approached our house. Smiling, I opened the door, but to say that I was surprised is to say nothing. My mother-in-law and the girls were there, watching TV. No Melinda? Hey, Dad, Esme said. Francine simply waved at me without looking up from the TV. Esme started calling me Daddy sometimes, Francine does too. Hi, Kevin, my mother-in-law said to me. Where's Melinda? I asked her. My mother-in-law told me that Melinda went out with friends. I noticed that she was acting strangely and wouldn't look me in the eyes when she said this. Was she hiding something? I asked her about specific friends, and she claimed she didn't know. Something was wrong. Then I asked her the next question. Why aren't the girls with Jean-Pierre? I asked my mother-in-law. Like her daughter, she is an attractive woman, there is no doubt about it, even at her age. But it's hard to say she's particularly smart. This became obvious when she answered my question about the girls and Jean-Pierre. They saw him before they left, she said, not realizing her mistake. Before anyone left? I asked, unfortunately knowing the likely answer. Jean-Pierre and Mel. She finally realized that she had said something wrong. I questioned her further, but she completely closed off. I told her that since I was home, she could leave. I would stay with the girls. At first, she insisted that she would stay, but she very quickly changed her mind. It was actually a nice evening, just me and the girls. I thought about how much I enjoyed spending time with them. I tried not to think about the long-term consequences of my relationship with the girls. Finally, I put them to bed and waited. It was already after 10 o'clock when I heard the sound of a car approaching. The headlights reflected on the living room ceiling. I heard the car drown out, and for several moments, nothing happened. I guess they saw my car and were wondering what to do. She looked worried when she entered the house. Emotionally, I was exhausted from all the extra hours I was putting in at work and working weekends to bring money into our home. With all the financial and business pressure I was under, I was incredibly stressed. Now I had pretty concrete evidence of some level of betrayal on the part of my wife. She just looked at me when she entered our house, an unpleasant expression on her beautiful face. "How was your night?" I asked, pretending to be calm. I was far from calm inside. "Fine," was her one-word answer. "I was surprised to see your mother," I said, wondering in which direction she would take the conversation. "She wanted to spend time with the girls," she said, her eyes no longer meeting mine. "Tuesday, isn't it? Jean-Pierre's night with the girls?" I asked, knowing for sure that this was the case. "He had something else," she replied. Tension filled the room. "Oh, and what was that?" I asked, just out of curiosity. "I don't know," she said, falling into a trap. "I'm tired. I'll go to bed." I sat and watched her walk up the stairs. My whole world, which was held together by threads, changed again. The slope this time was quite steep. Basically, my business was slowly dying, and the people I was responsible for would suffer. I promised to take care of them, and they trusted me. Now my suffering marriage, which I always felt I could fix once the business got better, may have just taken an unforgivable turn. I wasn't sure of the level of deception, but I was starting to have a pretty good idea. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, were the girls. Although I never said it out loud, deep down I felt responsible for these girls. Yes, Jean-Pierre is their biological father, but these girls need more than an unreliable, selfish man. I always planned to be there for them. Now I imagine scenarios where this might not happen. These thoughts were running through my head as I drove to my office that night. Sleep did not come easily, and I spent half the night at work. For the next few weeks, it was like I was in a submarine. I just worked, rarely going to the surface. When I was home, the situation between Melinda and me was neutral at best. I hadn't asked her questions about Jean-Pierre yet. Please don't get me wrong, I did not accept their relationship in any way, but when I thought a few steps ahead, confrontation could have devastating consequences for my relationship with the girls. I needed a plan. I hadn't come up with one yet, but I was sure that I would if there was one piece of good news. Business had stabilized. We were still far from my predictions, but it seemed like we had hit rock bottom. While preparing for my trip to Brazil, I optimistically estimated that I would be able to pay my salary for another 2 months, maybe 3. The farewell when I left for my trip in the morning could not be called warm. Melinda didn't even say goodbye. I received a hug from Esme and a bye, Daddy from Francine, that was all. As I was walking to the car, Esme suddenly appeared, alone. "Hey, Ease. What happened?" "You didn't even say goodbye to me," I told her good-naturedly. "Dad," she began. I loved it when she called me Daddy. "I'm afraid to tell you something," she said. "What is it, honey?" I asked. She stood there for a few moments and then spoke. She said that sometimes when I was not home, Jean-Pierre would come over, and sometimes, she said, he and her mother would go up to her mother's bedroom. I suspected something was going on, but in front of the girls, it was unforgivable. I thought for a few minutes. "Okay, thanks, Ease," I told her, trying to stay calm for her sake. "Now, honey, I really have to go." She hugged me and wouldn't let go. Finally, she spoke. "Do you promise that you will come back?" she asked. I took a deep breath. "I promise," I told her. During the long flight, I finally had some free time to analyze my situation with Melinda. I remembered Melinda at St. Thomas, the most popular girl in school and also the most beautiful. Obviously, Jean-Pierre had some kind of deep power over her. She was attached to him from an early age, and this attachment may never have completely disappeared. When we got together, I was, as it were, the opposite of Jean-Pierre, stable, practical, reliable, and a good male example for the girls. But Jean-Pierre was competitive, and he played the long game. He gradually and quietly integrated himself into her life and her bed. But, as I said, the attachment was formed years ago, and now Jean-Pierre was tightening it. Of course, my business problems contributed to this. Part of the initial attraction to me was job security, the security that Melinda desperately wanted when we started our relationship. My business problems eliminated that part of my attraction, and our marriage suffered. This was enough for Jean-Pierre. If it weren't for the girls, I would have told her to leave and kicked her out of my house. But my home was also a home for the girls. I couldn't imagine them being kicked out of the home they grew up in. At this point, I didn't know how to move forward. These thoughts bothered me as I flew through the night sky to Brazil. My arrival in the village of Taikan was accompanied by a festive atmosphere. As always, when I arrived, there was a feast, music playing, and, of course, a warm hug from my friend Mafi. The next day, we walked through the hardwood plantation, and Mafi and I talked about business. Mafi told me that they were ready for the next cutting and that the next batch would be ready soon. At this point, I hadn't told him about the business problems I was facing. I didn't know how to explain the situation. Later, we visited the orphanage, and I was happy to see the improvements and progress they had made. One thing that hadn't changed was the absolute joy of these children. Despite everything, they laughed, played, and sang. As we sat on a log overlooking the orphanage, Mafi studied me. "Kevin," he said, "I see the concern on your face." I tried to smile and brush off Mafi's comment, saying that everything was fine. The usually smiling Mafi continued to look at me, his brows furrowed, worried about me. "Why not tell Mafi about the concern?" he asked me. "The orphanage has always brought you joy." "Not today," I told him. He was right, it was always a joy to see these children, but today, my own problems outweighed that joy. I looked into the distance, thinking for several minutes. I then looked back at Mafi, his concern for me was obvious. I had to tell him what was happening. As we walked along the trails in the rainforest, I began to tell him about my problems in business. Mafi seemed much more concerned about me than about how business would be disrupted for Tyken. For some reason, I told him everything that was happening with Jean-Pierre, Melinda, and the girls. He listened, asked a few questions, and then we walked in silence for a while. "Kevin," said Mafi, "I'll give you something. You will hide this when you fly by." He waved his hand in the air, imitating an airplane. "Are you going to give me something to hide on the flight?" I asked. "Poison from a frog," he said, raising his fists to his mouth as if he were shooting from a poisonous tube, as he once showed me. "What?" I asked, confused. Mafi looked into my eyes and nodded. "But what will I do with the poison?" I asked, using his word for poison. We walked in silence for a while, and then he began to speak. "In the old days, when Issa from another village came to the village of Tyken to try to take away the women of Tyken, take away the shelter of Tyken, we defended the village." He imitated an arrow, puffing out his cheeks and releasing air. "Kevin, you take it and hide it on the way," he said, giving me a carved wooden vessel. I felt a small amount of liquid inside. It was tightly closed with a cork and some kind of wax to seal it. "Kevin," he said again, "keep the poison away from the skin. It's dangerous," he told me, squeezing my forearm tightly. I didn't need Mafi's poison. What was I going to do with it? I knew that I could not refuse the gift, it would be an insult. But what was I supposed to do with it? I thanked him, and soon it was time to leave. "Mafi," I said, "thank you for your friendship." I told him, hugging him. I kept the small wooden vessel in the pocket of my backpack, and somehow it didn't raise any alarms when I went through security. I was sure that transporting this material was strictly prohibited. When my flight from Brazil landed in Atlanta, I was surprised to see so many missed calls, including 3 from Ryan in my office and 2 from my friend Alan Church. Other calls included 2 clients from California, several numbers I didn't recognize, a text from Taylor Pilkington, and a text from Melinda. Melinda's text read, "We need to talk." A few weeks ago, I might have interpreted Melinda's text as a potentially positive development. No more. Taylor's text read, "Call me, it's important." Compared to the other messages, Taylor's message was the least important in my opinion. This opinion would soon change. I called Ryan first. He answered after a few moments but finally picked up. "Kevin," he sounded out of breath and excited. I quickly prepared myself for more bad news. "Where are you?" "I tried to contact you." "Have you already talked to someone?" He spoke very quickly, bombarding me with questions. "Ryan, slow down. I just landed. I didn't talk to anyone." "Relax, take a breath, and tell me what is happening," I calmly told him. "Okay, we received calls all day." The cheap wood's first name turned out to be bad, Ryan went on to say. "The material cracks, and changes in humidity affect the wood. The product was curled and deformed on the racks." I assumed such a possibility. This was great news. "We're getting calls from all over the place," Ryan explained. "This must be what Alan and some of the other messages I received were calling about." "Okay," I said. the first thing we're doing is raising prices by 10%. I will order a new batch from Brazil, start taking orders, and I'll call him. Finally, some good news, I thought. I'll do it, Ryan answered. My flight was about to board, but I needed to call Alan first. Hey, buddy. Alan began. Are you abroad? I'm back and about to catch a flight to CC, I told him. Okay, he said, suddenly shifting into business mode. I need a lot of your wood. I decided to play a little game. I told him that I was low on inventory and that my next 2 orders were pre-booked. None of this was specifically true. Come on, Kev, he said, now playing on our friendship. Weren't I with you when you first started? He was, and I appreciated it. Alan, I'm about to board a flight. Once I'm in the office, I'll see what I can do, I told him. It isn't enough, he said, desperate now, begging. Okay, here's what I'll do, I told him. You give me an annual order for, and I name the amount, 5% higher than the regular price, and I guarantee you inventory for a year. He hesitated. Alan, my good friend, I told him, this is my last sentence. I will send the order. Thanks, buddy, he said. As I sat in my chair heading home, I felt a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. With positive business news, suddenly my cash flow problems seemed solved. All financial stress suddenly disappeared. But I still had problems with my marriage and the girls. I'd contact Melinda when I land and see what was on her mind. After landing, I called Melinda. Voicemail. I tried to return a few of my calls, but it was too late. No one answered. I'd call them back tomorrow, Friday, from the office. Suddenly, the phone rang. I thought it would be Melinda, but no, it was Taylor Pilkington. What did she want that was so important? I almost didn't answer. Kevin, she began, I need to talk to you. It is very important. She emphasized the word important. What's happening? I asked her. No, I need to see you. I have to tell you this face to face, she said, her penchant for dramatization evident. Taylor, listen, I began. I've been on the road all day. I'm exhausted. Maybe it's just, at that moment, my phone vibrated. Melinda, I said. Hey, Taylor, I'll call you back. Better make it important, she told me when I hung up. Melinda, I said in greeting. Are you back? She asked, obviously knowing that I was abroad. Yes, I'm going home, I told her. She hesitated. You better not come home right now, she told me, for the sake of the girls. She knew that this was my weakness. Why? I asked, but I think I knew the answer. Listen, it's complicated, she said. We need to talk. I know, just not now. Not yet. Maybe on the weekend? Please do this for the girls, she added. I was seething with anger as I drove through the rain. Finally, I answered, okay, but we need to talk soon. Okay, I heard her quiet answer. Several moments passed before I realized she had hung up. I drove in a state of prostration, vaguely heading toward my office, where I had already slept for too many nights. Mentally, I started organizing my day and the calls that needed to be made on Friday. Then I thought about Taylor. Perhaps it would be better to deal with what she had to say as soon as possible. One less thing to do on Friday. Meet me at Stagey Coach in 20 minutes, she told me after I called her back. Stagey Coach was a working-class bar in South Puget Sound. It was dark and cozy. We arrived at the same time. Taylor looked worried, and my curiosity about this meeting intensified. Okay, Taylor, I began. What was so important that we had to meet in person? I looked at Taylor, still a beautiful woman, and wondered why she never got married. Kevin, she said, I just don't know how to tell you this, but I must. You've been a good friend for a long time. You hired my sister, and she needs this job. I couldn't leave it. I should have told you, she told me. Okay, so what is this? I asked, tired and starting to lose patience. We had a girls' night out this week, me, Melinda, and a couple of other people, she began. It was one of those nights where the alcohol was flowing and Melinda got very drunk. Taylor paused, and I felt my heart sink. She started talking about Jean-Pierre. She told us that she and Jean-Pierre were back together. We were all surprised. We had seen what he put her through over the years. We all asked how she could be with Jean-Pierre again when she was married to you. She said that Jean-Pierre was the father of her children and that they were kindred spirits. She claimed she had a plan. Here's her plan, Taylor continued. She's going to divorce you, take the house, and half of your business. Then she plans to persuade her mother to move the girls into your house. She and Jean-Pierre will move into her mother's apartment on the embankment. They will visit the girls every week but will be free to live their own lives. I remember asking her, "Aren't you serious?" Her response was, "You're damn right I am. I'm tired of being a mother. I'm finally going to enjoy the life I deserve." That's exactly what she said, Taylor remarked, looking for a reaction on my face. After hearing this, I had many questions. What made her think her mother would agree to this? I asked. She said that after her father died, the girls became the most important thing in her mother's life. Besides, she told us that her mother always does what Melinda tells her. When we questioned her stupid plan, she started getting angry. She told us this was the life she deserved. She continued to say that once she sold your business, she and Jean-Pierre would travel, no girls. It was almost like high school, Taylor continued, when she was the queen and Jean-Pierre her king. She treated us all as her subjects, like she was better than us. Finally, Melinda realized she may have said too much. She warned us not to repeat a word of this to anyone. I struggled with it all week, Taylor said, but I knew what a good person you were and how you helped Janice find a job. I just had to tell you. I sat stunned. I knew Melinda could be selfish, but this was something else. I realized that if she abandoned the girls, leaving them with her mother, they would never receive the support they needed. She seemed to show no respect for her daughters. It was evil. Angry towards me, but also towards the girls, she was, I realized, just an evil woman. I had a lot to think about. One thing I knew for sure was that I wasn't going to let them do it. Taylor rambled on for a while about how bad she felt. Finally, I stood up, thanked her, and then she hugged me tightly. In other circumstances, I would have enjoyed this physical sensation much more, but not today. I had too much on my mind. The next day, Friday, I told myself that I would focus 100% on my business. I'd solve the Melinda issue later. Demand for our products and complaints about the defective would only increase. We were now accepting orders that we would not be able to ship for several weeks. The market didn't care about this. They were just happy knowing that they would get their materials from us someday. In the middle of the day, I received a call from Jack Valentine. He asked about business and mentioned hearing about the defective wood from McLean's and other locations. We talked about wood for a few more minutes. "Listen, Jack, things are getting crazy here. I better get back to business," I told him. "Okay," he said, "but there is something I wanted to talk to you about." "That can wait. I'll call you in a few weeks, and we'll have lunch," I agreed. At the end of the day, I reviewed my budget projections. We were going plus 30% above my original budget. I was very pleased with this new information. Now, I thought, I need to think about Melinda. I kept thinking as I ran along the path on Saturday morning. I knew I had the advantage of knowing, thanks to Taylor, what their plan was. My weakness was the girls. She knew she could manipulate me, using them as leverage, pure evil. I reconsidered my options over and over again as I ran, and every idea had some stumbling block that left either the business or the girls vulnerable. Finally, I came up with a plan. It was far from perfect, but it could work. The results would be harsh, but I couldn't think of any other way to save the girls. Several times, I wondered if I could do it. I decided that I should. Later, I called Melinda and demanded to meet her at home that evening at 6 p.m. She agreed. "And Kevin," she said, "Jean-Pierre will be here too." For the sake of the plan, I protested and expressed anger towards Jean-Pierre. In fact, it was perfect. I had a few things to do that morning. First, I needed to find a library with internet access, one not local. Then, I needed a grocery store that sold prepared foods, somewhere further away from me. I found the library and waited 30 minutes to access a computer. I did my research, not perfect, but almost. I Googled a few other topics to try and cover my tracks. I thought it would be almost impossible to connect my library activities to me, but I played it safe. Next was the grocery store. My purchases included a few non-perishable items: rice, coffee, 6 bottles of expensive beer, thin rubber gloves, and a jar of regular cocktail sauce. I also bought a pre-made tray of boiled shrimp. In the center of the round plastic tray was a small bowl of red cocktail sauce surrounded by large shrimp. Next up was my office. On Saturday, there was no one in the building except me. There were no surveillance cameras. I carefully brought my grocery store purchases into the small kitchen. I put on my recently purchased gloves and found my hiking backpack. At 6 o'clock sharp, I was home. I didn't knock, although I almost felt like I should. I brought a brown anonymous bag with the logo of a store different from the one I had previously shopped at. "Kevin, welcome." "Come in," Jean-Pierre said generously in his greeting. This is my home, I thought, but my face remained indifferent, slightly submissive. "Mel," he shouted up the stairs. "Kevin is here." "Please sit down," he said, directing me to the kitchen table. "What do we have in the package?" he asked, nodding towards the paper bag I brought. I opened the bag and pulled out 6 bottles of premium beer and a large round tray of shrimp with a small bowl of cocktail sauce in the center, all covered with a clear plastic lid. There were a few other things that I left in the bag when I put it on the floor. "I think we need to be civilized when we discuss," I told Jean-Pierre. "Exactly," my friend Jean-Pierre replied, starting to eat the shrimp, dipping them in the cocktail sauce. At that moment, Melinda entered the kitchen. We must give her credit. She looked uncomfortable, a little guilty about our negotiations today. "Melinda, look what Kevin brought," he said, pointing to the shrimp. "It's delicious," he added, licking his fingers covered in cocktail sauce. Melinda carefully picked up a shrimp and dipped it into the sauce. "Thank you, Kevin," she said quietly. To hide the fact that I hadn't eaten, I took a beer. Jean-Pierre opened his second beer. "So," I said, "it's your move. Tell me what you think." Melinda gave me a highly embellished version of what Taylor had already told me, omitting any mention of her mother moving in with the girls or about selling my business. Today's topic was my home. "I think it's in the girls' best interests to stay here in the house," Melinda said, "and, of course, as their mother, I should be here too." Jean-Pierre continued to shovel shrimp into his mouth, nodding his head in agreement, but his main focus was on the food. "And what do you suggest we do with our marriage?" I asked, knowing exactly what her plan was. "Kevin," she began, bowing her head slightly with an air of sympathy, "you are still important to me. I will never forget how you helped me and the girls when they were little. You will always be a part of our lives." But Jean-Pierre is their father, and we got in touch again. "I think a quiet divorce would be the best solution for the sake of the girls." I was silent, nodding, until I noticed the effects. "Do you like shrimp?" I asked Melinda. "Oh yes," she exclaimed, taking another shrimp, dipping it in the sauce, and eating it. "You see, Kevin," Melinda said, "you were an important part of all our lives." Jean-Pierre began. "There were times in my youth when I might have made errors in judgment, perhaps errors of path," he said gravely, shaking his head as he reflected on his minor failures. I noticed that Melinda had dipped another shrimp. Nobody seemed to notice that I hadn't eaten anything. Jean-Pierre continued, "Luckily, when I was struggling, Melinda found you," he said with an insincere smile on his face. "You did a wonderful job giving them a home," he said, raising his hands in an all-encompassing gesture and looking around my house. "You, Kevin," he continued, "have been my deputy, and I thank you," tilting his head slightly in my direction. "You gave them shelter when they needed it, and now," he said with a wide smile, "it's time for me to take charge again." Any regret I might have felt for this man evaporated. I watched Melinda looking at him. He had some kind of power over her. She was smart, but she still fell for his lies. "Good news," she continued, eating more shrimp. "Now, Kevin, I think we are all reasonable adults and can work together to determine the best path forward. He continued to ramble. We must think about the girls and their welfare first and foremost. Then the unexpected happened. Jean-Pierre felt bad and fell to the floor, unable to finish speaking. Jean-Pierre! Melinda shouted. Kevin, look at him! Do something, she screamed. I suggested calling 911. Melinda nodded, but then she too began to feel ill. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later. Jean-Pierre was in critical condition, and Melinda also needed help. Later, the police contacted me. The preliminary diagnosis from the hospital was severe poisoning. I told the police that we had discussed child custody issues and that my relationship with Jean-Pierre was friendly. Doctors said Melinda's condition was unusual and created a medical mystery. With genuine grief, I explained to the girls about the accident that had taken Jean-Pierre's life and paralyzed their mother. There were real tears flowing between the three of us. Then Esme asked the expected question, "What will happen to us?" she asked, looking scared. Well, I began, "You could probably live with your grandmother." As soon as I said this, I noticed protests beginning to appear. Francine looked at me with concern, and Esme shook her head. Melinda's mother was a nice woman and could probably handle a long weekend, or maybe a week, of watching the girls just fine, but she wouldn't be the firm parent these teenage girls needed. Even at their age, they understood this. Or, I continued, the three of us could continue to live here. They both nodded in agreement. Many years ago, before we got married, Melinda and I bought a long-term care policy. If you remember, we bought it based on her father's neurological condition and the stress it caused her mother. We chose the most expensive policy and regularly paid large premiums every month. Who could have known then under what circumstances the value of the policy would be used? Now, every Sunday, the girls and I visited Ellenhurst, an adult care facility in Bridger, about 15 miles away. We usually brought flowers to brighten up the austere decor of her room. I looked into her eyes as the girls told her about school, their friends, certain television programs, and their lives. I truly believe I saw glimpses of warmth as she listened to the girls talk. It was different when she looked at me. Somehow, through her emotionless state, she was able to express anger. When she looked at me, I guess it was more than my imagination, but the girls never noticed. I saw hatred in her eyes. I asked the doctor at Ellenhurst about her condition. It's unlikely that she will recover, he told me. If she had received medical care faster, everything could have been different. By the time she got to the hospital, her nervous system was too damaged, he explained. Her brain is fine, and so is her vision. She can hear and understand what is being said, but her nervous system has been damaged, so she can neither move nor speak. The good news is that, other than that, she looks healthy and should live many more years, he added. Did you hear, dear? I asked her after the doctor left. The doctor said that you are healthy, I said with a wide smile. I didn't think it was possible, but her eyes expressed even more hatred as she looked at me. Many months later, vacation at last, I thought as the plane flew southwest. We had been talking for months, but it had been a long time since I'd actually seen her. I was attracted to her at that high school dance. It would be interesting to meet her again. We discussed our plans, and I thought it would be a surprise for her. I hope she enjoyed it as much as I did. Melinda's mother happily stayed with the girls for a week. Much had changed, but some things remained the same. The girls and I lived in my house, and yes, they missed their mother, but overall they seemed to be coping well. Jean-Pierre was rarely mentioned. Another thing that remained the same was my long-distance friendship with Mafi. He never asked if I used poison, and I never mentioned it. I remembered my last visit with him. Kevin, he said, hugging me by the shoulders, Mafi sees that you are happy now. I simply nodded. No explanation was needed. My business had changed too. Over the past year, Jack Valentine and I merged our companies. This was something Jack wanted to talk to me about months ago. Jack was the CEO, and I was the president. Together, we now had 22 employees and were doing great. Sometimes I missed the crazy times when it was just the four of us, Ryan, Janice, Albert, and me, but more often than not, I was happy with the structure of our larger company. With Jack in charge, I could afford a well-deserved week's vacation in Maui. She came from Japan, where she worked. Our communication in recent months had only been remote. I thought this was how relationships worked in the modern world. Now, finally, we would be together. My flight landed about an hour before hers. I rented a car. Finally seeing her and hugging her after all our correspondence was incredible. She looked even better in person. "Oh my God, what a flight," she sighed. "Our check-in at the hotel is only at 4 o'clock, I told her. "Just take me to the beach. I have a swimsuit under my clothes. I need to feel the ocean," she told me. "Okay," I smiled. Finally, I thought, this will be interesting. We parked and stripped down to our swimsuits. She looked better than she did in high school. She caught my eye and smiled. "This way," I told her as we walked along the hot sand. We climbed over a rocky outcrop, and there was a beautiful bay on the other side. I wondered how long it would take her to notice. We were about halfway through before she realized, "Is this a beach for those who like to sunbathe without anything?" she asked, stopping and looking at me. I couldn't tell if she was angry or not. We continued walking and found a spot where we laid out our beach towels. "Nicole," I said, "you don't need to take anything off." Yes, it was Taylor's cousin Nicole Arns, my date to graduation, she said, looking at me, smiling. "You stared at me on our first date. It's high time you saw them in person." "What do you think?" she said. "I think you need sunscreen," I replied with a smile. "What do you think of our second installment today?" I feel like this part was kind of tense and disturbing. What do you think? Write in the comments. See you in the comments.